but they're not dying of a virus per se. You don't see any of the signs in those 5,000 patients.
All right, but the virus is causing that problem, right? I mean, in some ways, isn't it semantics to say that, well, the virus isn't causing a fever like the way a virus would, but it is, in fact, causing this hemoglobin problem, this inability to carry oxygen correctly, something that was pointed out by the MD in New York, Kyle Seidel, who came forward and said, this seems like my patients are at 30,000 feet. So on one hand, you would say, oh, it's not a virus, people shouldn't be afraid, but there are people that this virus is causing this hypoxic issue, is it not?
It's participating in it for sure. I think it's I mean, we haven't proven that yet, but I think there's a distinct possibility that the virus is participating in the unmasking of this hemoglobin shift. And when I say unmasking, it can't be causing it directly, else everybody who got exposed to the virus would be having a hypoxic injury. But very few people who get exposed to the virus and mount an antibody response and all of the typical things you would expect actually presented with blue organ failure. Very few percent. And so the protein, there's a new protein, we're told, and we'll figure this needs to be proven out still, but we're told there's a new RNA strand, that codes for a new protein that is different than SARS and MERS. Okay, great. But something in SARS and MERS did the same thing. And so there's been something stable in these coronaviruses that is unmasking in a small percentage of patients this hemoglobin type effect. So then should we say, well, it's the virus causing it? Well, if it was the virus causing it, again, everybody who was exposed would have that. So what is the virus doing? The virus seems to be unmasking toxicity of our environment. And there's something really poetic about that. The people that are dying from this are by and large in areas where there's high agricultural residues of Roundup and high residues of small particulate air pollution, smaller than 2.5 microns. And so northern Italy, New York City, Seattle, Louisiana, those are all the highest areas in Europe and the United States of those two phenomenon, agricultural toxicity coupled with air pollution and small particulate matter. In China, that happens to be Wuhan and that whole Hubei province. Hubei province has the highest Roundup and kind of destruction of the soils, and then Beijing and south of Beijing has the highest concentrations of the air particulate. And Hubei is toxic. We're talking about levels of micron particulate that are 40-fold that seen in New York. And so massive toxicity in the air pollution in Hubei. And so in that air pollution, we know it carries many things, including cyanide. And so cyanide, we know, is a part of normal air pollution. In fact, a really nice, Earth Justice paper got released just months before this whole pandemic, story unfolded. There was a Earth Justice mandate for kind of a class action lawsuit demand on the EPA for not accounting and not doing anything about the rising levels of cyanide in many of the U.S. cities. And we were above, safe thresholds of cyanide over and over again, and there was nothing being done. And so Earth Justice recognized that, and then months later we see people dying of something that looks like cyanide poisoning. And so that what I think is interesting is the possibility that nature, in a toxic stew of dying soils in a glyphosate Roundup intense farming area of China, has unmasked the relationship of cyanide to hemoglobin. And is this an adaptive event happening as nature has exuded this? If this is a military operation, again, they are mimicking something that happened in 2001-2, and so it's not new. They've recreated, and it looks to have a much lower death toll than SARS did. SARS, we seem to have a death toll maybe around 8%, 10%. It's hard to know because we didn't really do good universal screening. May have been a lot of asymptomatic people with SARS too, but certainly this time around, I think we see a much lower mortality rate. It's down in that 0.1 to 0.3% range, probably something like that. The most recent Stanford study looking at Santa Clara as an entire city population is coming in around 0.1%, something like that. So,
right.
So we're somewhere around normal flu and mortality. So if it's new, if it's military, their agenda is not to kill people maybe, and they don't know what they're playing with. So is there a virus? Yes. What is it doing? It seems to be unmasking the toxicity of our environment that we've created. And the virus itself is not enough to cause the death. We have to have the perfect storm of air pollution. And every 1 micron increase has a 20-fold increase of death by that Harvard study. Every 1 micron of air pollution. And when I tell you there's 40 fold increases in that micron density in Hubei, the chances of having an epidemic of hypoxemic injury in there is catastrophically high. You're in the hundreds of fold increased risk of death by living in that environment. And so we saw the death rate suddenly drop to near zero, not because they were in confinement. I believe it was because if you look at the tracking of their air pollution levels, it went below 40 microns per cubic meter of air in the 2 weeks following the cessation of activity in Hubei. And so by stopping human activity, we took the cyanide out of the air, and suddenly nobody was dying of COVID. Everybody's like suspicious, like China's lying. People must still be dying. And I love it that the United States always thinks that China's lying, always thinks that Russia's lying. Like that's our default mechanism. Like, who do we think we're not lying? Like, who in the media do you trust right now? Like, who
Nobody.
do you think's not lying here? Like,
Right.
And suddenly it's China that's lying? United States of America, if you keep having this superiority complex over the Chinese, you are a fool. Because we have hospitals that can't even figure out how to get masks on their doctors and nurses because they don't know how to produce a mask because China produces it for us.
Right.
And so we are so lazy, ultimately. We are so lazy and so capitalistically oriented that we didn't even consider the repercussions of a mask that was 7 cents cheaper to make in China than the United States, so we outsourced it. And so we are not ingenious. When it comes to knowing threat, knowing security, we are reactive, and we are pissed off at the world, and we're